Welcome back to the True Images podcast. I'm here with Ivan and Margot.
Hello.
John Wolf.
Hi.
And Jason McDowell.
Hey there.
I always want to say Ivan McDowell for some reason. Then I got to John and I was like, wait, John McDowell, what am I talking about?
It's the Scottish Filipino.
Yeah. Scottish
with
Filipino.
with a Russian first name.
That's right.
And a Spanish last name.
I feel like that those
and
are
a Portuguese middle name.
Good podcast names. And John Wolf is also very good. It sounds like an author's name. Like
there's a number of John Wolfs that exist. If you do a Google search, you'll end up with everything from university professors to professional video game players.
Really?
So, yeah.
So you
and
share
you're
it
all
with a lot of people.
Yes.
You are a video game player also.
I am.
See? You just never know who you're listening to. But we have a lot of people on this podcast that have written a book or are in the middle. Actually, one of the fun things in doing this project is I found like some behind the scenes info that some of our people are writing books. So that was exciting. But would you guys, I feel like I was going to ask, would you write a book? But I feel like all of you could and probably like should write a book. And I would definitely read it and advocate for your book. But would you? Would that be enjoyable for you? Would you have a topic you already know that you would write about?
So I have a book chapter coming out in December on a book that's teaching about philosophy, and it's titled "I Don't Have the Guts for This: How Losing 20% of My Small Intestine Changed My Pedagogy." I've got a couple other articles published on teaching and teaching philosophy. The biggest thing, though, was, of course, the dissertation, and that's a couple hundred pages worth of stuff that is technically a book because it's all bound up and nice looking in the library at Baylor University where I got my PhD. But I mean, I would do a book because it's part and parcel. In fact, I'm on contract for a textbook here for the university too. So it's part and parcel with what we do. Probably if I was writing for work, it would be tied to teaching, disability, or if I was really lucky, ancient medieval philosophy. If I could write about anything, though, probably a work of fiction, sci-fi, fantasy.
Nice.
That sort of thing. But that's how we roll. We roll the nerdy. We instead of writing dirty, we're white and nerdy. We follow the Weird Al sort of thing.
Cue the music.
Yeah, that's
we'll
right.
get the rights.
I love that John's answers are just like so good. So good.
That's a kind way of saying very long-winded. So.
No, they're just like, you're on a totally different level than I would ever. That's fantastic. Would you ever write a book, Jason?
See, I've thought about that before, and then I've been glad that I haven't. Because it's like the ideas that I get, I either a couple of years later realize that I think differently about something, or I realize 10 other people have already written a lot more eloquent books on that. And so for now, I think a lot of my calling, for lack of a better word, in life involves probably teaching with people in conversations in real time. But I don't know, I'd have to feel like I had something really good to say and to contribute, just because there's so many books that have been written, and I learn from other teachers all the time. It's amazing, but sometimes I feel like the thoughts that I have, I mean, I don't know if they quite measure up. So we'll see. It'd have to be a topic where I felt like I had something good, but also maybe something new or novel to contribute, and something that 5 years later I wouldn't just want to renege on. So,
yeah. I'm going to say this so we have this time stamped if someone steals this idea. But I've always wanted. Have you ever seen those like Wreck This Journal where it's like an interactive thing, and so each day you do something different? Sometimes like tear out a page, write down something that you don't like, and then crumple it up and throw it away. Something interactive like that. That I've been working on. I have like the theological like devotionals that are going to be associated with it, but it's going to be like a worship book, like how do you worship the Lord? What do you worship? Type thing. So I'm working on it right now. And it's more like an interactive devotional, something like like a 14-day thing where each day you go over a different topic of a theological topic, and you do something fun with it. A lot of art is a part of it. That's design, and but I always wanted to compile a book of just quotes of different crazy things students have said, like in youth group, and then also now, at this elementary school, just some of the crazy things that kids say. But that's one thing some of my coworkers were talking about, just putting it together. So I've been compiling that. But I don't know. I think the same thing is like, is there something worth saying to write down that someone hasn't said?
So as somebody who is surrounded by authors, I've got a bookshelf of these are the books that my friends have written. These are the books, the things that I've done.
That's awesome.
And I've got autographed copies from friends of mine, books that they've done. Like the whole idea of, well, I don't know if I can do it because I don't know if what's important enough. And the thing is, like, it's not just the information that you're sharing, but it's also the voice that you're giving.
Yeah.
And so, as somebody who is, say, Filipino and living in Mormon, Utah, that even if you're retreading ssimilar things, it's still from a voice that is uniquely yours. And there's a Jewish philosopher, and her name escapes me, but the phrase that she regularly uses is voices in the chorus, and we always want to make sure that there are voices in the chorus. And so for both of you, I would say that there's something valuable in the process of putting a book together, of working in community for it. Jim has done several. We have a friend of ours, Jim, who has done several works together, works of creative fiction, works of scholarship. And, it's the idea that to sound as jerky as possible, which is my line of work anyway, who are you to say whether your voice isn't significant enough?
I think you set up this podcast, Carlie, to minister to me.
And write a book. Now.
Conviction is falling heavily.
I know. I got to get back to work. Let's end the podcast. I got to work.
That's right.
That's a great question.
Oh, man.
That it is, though, so I've been working on this True Images for a while, and I've asked a lot of authors, because that same thing that you were saying, Jason, is it's like, okay, but even sometimes last month, I'm like, I don't know if I would even write that again, or write it the same way, or phrase it the same way. And so you're like, oh my gosh, in 5 years and 10 years, am I even going to think that this was beneficial? But one thing actually Moe Sam, whose interview we listened to last week, said was her first book was kind of like a ramp to her second book. So people who read her and knew her as an author, the first book was kind of like it opened the doors, and then the second one ramped up a little, and then the third one was a lot more in depth and a little more academic. And so she was saying it's just, it's all just a part of the journey if you're writing, and that's what you're doing.
And that's the thing. Like, it's not just normal folks, it's everyone. So again, in my field of philosophy, there are figures that you can tell where they are writing based on the style and method. So, in Plato, you have early and middle, late dialogues that are all tied to his state of being and understanding about metaphysics, all of that. You have 20th century authors like Ludwig Wittgenstein, where you have two major works that he wrote, one very early in his career, one that was published posthumously, that really defined that. And so this whole, I don't know how I'll look back on it in 5 years. So what? Maybe it'll be completely different. Maybe it'll be you have different.
I needed to hear that today.
Different notion. So
Thank
what?
you, John.
Like maybe what you do is you use it as a way to timestamp for yourself. So you say, okay, this is what I thought. This is why I thought it. And now that I've grown or thought or realized this thing or encountered this person or had this event, it's caused me to change my view. And then you begin to appreciate that watershed moment for yourself and more. And so, so what if it's different?
That's pretty good. That's why John is the pastor of the pastors. That's
right.
Everyone. Okay, that was really good advice. I'm going to listen to this again someday when I need to hear that. And also, the person that we're listening to today, Robert Jensen, he is an author, and he has a really great punchy name for his book. And you can also, he talks about where you can get it for free, which is fantastic because it's out of publishing. But we had a really great conversation about a lot of things, a lot about consent and what that really means and looks like, and the ethics behind the commercial sex industry and specifically pornography. And he's had a lot of great experience talking with students and having debates. And I think one of the things I've so appreciated about so many people doing this podcast, but especially like Robert, is we have really different belief systems and views and, views of the world and how we operate. But he was so willing to have a conversation. And one of the things that he does really well is says, you don't have to believe everything I say or agree with me, but let's just talk about it and be curious and ask really good and thoughtful questions so that we both know if we're really thinking through an idea thoroughly. And I know, is my position solid? Is it good? And it's actually going to strengthen me if I'm able to have a really good conversation and be curious about what you think and why. And I think that's a really great thing that we wanted to do with this podcast, was to say there's probably not a lot of overlap that Robert and I have in a lot of other areas, but in this area we really do. And I think that's great because this isn't supposed to be something that you listen to where we say, here's everything to believe, but to make you ask deeper questions and be a little bit more thoughtful and intentional and have a really robust reason why you support something or don't. And I think Robert does a really great job of that. So we'll jump into the interview with him and be back to discuss it after that. Robert, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
I've been listening to a lot of your lectures, and I know that one of your books is available online for free. So there are a lot of ways that people can listen to your thoughts and some work that you've done in this area. And I think that'll be a really great resource for people.
Yes, my website has a lot of articles. And as you said, the book I wrote in 2007 called Getting Off about the porn industry is available for free. Sadly, a book I wrote nearly 20 years ago is almost as relevant today as it was then. There's some updating that needs to be, but only in the negative sense that the porn industry has gotten more brutal, more cruel, more degrading, more racist, and despite the insights of so many women over so many years about how to confront the sexual exploitation industries, we're still way behind the curve on that one.
Listening to one of your lectures this morning, actually, and I believe it was in 2013, and it was so relevant, but also, I mean, you were talking about some of the statistics, and there were students asking you questions, and I was just thinking about just the loads of information that we have now and how it's, unfortunately, like you said, just really a steep incline downhill.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this recently. It was the 50th anniversary of a men's organization, a pro-feminist men's organization. So I've been thinking in those long-term, decades-long timeframes. The original feminist critique of pornography, out of which I base my own work, came in the 1970s. Right? 50 years ago, women were highlighting the fact that pornography is not just, harmless sex on the screen, but sex in the context of domination and subordination. And when you think about it, you're too young to remember this, but when I was a kid, the pornography they were analyzing was remarkably tame by contemporary standards. And so I think it raises an uncomfortable question for the culture. A group of women who were making this critique a half a century ago turned out to be right. Their predictions were on target. Their assessment of the nature of the industry was on target. And yet they're still considered irrelevant to the conversation. To what that tells me is a culture profoundly afraid of dealing with basic questions about power and sexuality. And that's why I think it's so important for us to continue having this conversation.
Absolutely. And I would love to start with an introduction to you and what brought you to radical feminism, but also if you could explain to our audience what that means, because I know a lot of our audience are probably consider themselves politically conservative and conservative on the spectrum of Christianity. And so feminism is like another F word to them and they go, well, okay. And they might turn it off if they hear us even just say that word. And then to hear radical, a lot of people think extremist. So those are two words that might make people a little bit uneasy, but I'd love to hear you explain to us what that means and what brought you to that.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that we can get locked into very superficial assessments of political ideologies. You mentioned conservative. In political terms, I'm on the left. In personal terms, I'm probably one of the most conservative people you'll find. Well, that's just another way of saying I'm pretty boring. My lifestyle is not radical in any sense. My politics are, and there's a connection there. So let's go back to what brought me into this. I was 30 years old. I was going back to school, and I used to joke that at the time I knew everything there was to know about feminism. I knew that feminists were ugly women who couldn't get dates. In other words, I'd accepted what the dominant culture had told me, and I made fun of feminism. But when I finally started meeting feminists, talking to them, engaging their work, reading feminists, I realized feminism wasn't a threat to me as a man. Feminism was a gift, especially the more radical feminism that is rooted in this critique of pornography, prostitution, and other forms of sexual exploitation of women. When I say it's a gift, one of the things I've always recognized once I started down this road was that the idea of being a real man was a fantasy. And one of the ways I realized that is every man I've ever met, including people I would have put in the category of real men, the high school quarterback, the tough guy, whatever it was, they all feared they weren't man enough. And my point is that, let's call it patriarchy. It's an old-fashioned word, but it still works. A term for a male-dominated society. It not only puts men in a position of domination over women, it puts men in competition with each other. And most men I know are afraid they're not man enough to win those competitions. And so when I say feminism, especially radical feminism, is a gift to me, I mean it gave me a way to think outside of that very narrow notion of what it means to be a man. And in more specific terms, like so many young people in this culture, I had used pornography as a child and a young man growing up, and I felt locked into a very unhealthy cycle of dependency on pornography. And here were these women critiquing pornography and giving me a way to understand my own struggle. So the first and most important thing I would say to any man listening is feminism is nothing to be afraid of. It's something to embrace to help us deal with our own struggles, as well as give us a chance to be part of a movement that helps women and girls who are, of course, facing struggles that are far more dangerous in many ways than those that men face.
Excuse me. Thank you so much for sharing parts of your personal story with us. And tell us, why is radical feminism not supportive of pornography and the distinction there? Because most people think of feminism and empowering women, and pornography and just the commercial sex industry at large has kind of been framed as something that's very empowering for women, and post-Me Too movement as a way for them to take back power that was taken from them. So why does radical feminism oppose that?
Right. Well, like any other social movement, there's never been a single kind of feminism, just like there's not a single kind of political organization in any tradition. In fact, some of the most intense arguments in politics are not between competing people, but within their own groups. So the radical feminist tradition comes out of the 1960s, and it looked at the fundamental way that male domination structures society. And it's impossible, I think, if you acknowledge that, not to look at the way men sexually exploit women. And that happens in a lot of ways, but one of the ways it happens, especially in the modern world, is the commercial sex industry. That means prostitution, the buying and selling of actual women, whether it's on the street or through escort services or massage parlors. It means now the media form in pornography, right? Whether it's a traditional porn company or user-generated content now, whatever, right? These are simply ways that that men buy and sell women's bodies for sexual pleasure. And women lose in that equation, and that's obvious. The data is very clear. The experiences of women in the sexual exploitation industries, which is the term I use for all of these ways of buying and selling women's bodies, right, suffer psychologically and physically from their exploitation in those industries. Now, not all feminists buy that analysis. Some are quick to say, well, those women are making choices. And I agree, they, of course, are making choices. Every time a person does something in the world, in some sense, they're making a choice. After all, when a heroin addict decides to use that drug, they're making a choice of some sort. I used to say when students decide to take an exam in my class, they're choosing to take that exam. But they're choosing under conditions they didn't establish. They know that if they don't take the exam, they'll fail the course. They'll have to retake it another semester, pay another tuition. So sure, do students choose to take my exams in the old days? Sure, they did. But under conditions they did not create. So it's not enough to say, did somebody choose it? We have to say, what are the conditions under which people choose? And that's a more complex set of questions. Radical feminism has stayed true to focusing on the conditions under which those choices are made. And unfortunately, from my point of view, other strands of feminism have ignored that. And this is a real fault line among feminists today. I wish I could say radical feminists were the dominant tradition and this critique of pornography and prostitution was at the forefront of feminist thinking. But unfortunately, it's right now a minority position. But that's why I think it's so important to keep talking about it. Another thing that I think is really important to highlight is a lot of people think a radical political ideology, like radical feminism, is somehow at odds with our everyday experience. But I don't think that's true about radical feminism. I think radical feminism is in line with the everyday experience, certainly of most women, and also of many men. So when radical feminists highlight the importance of male sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, you don't have to convince most women that this is a world in which they're vulnerable to that abuse and exploitation, because every day they have that experience. I'm not saying, every man is looking to rape every woman. That's a caricature of the radical feminist analysis. But it's not difficult to understand that we live in a world in which men pose a threat to women. And it doesn't mean I'm an evil person. Right? It means that the organization of power in the society we live in dictates that reality. I used to say, there's a lot of studies about how many women have experienced sexual abuse, let's say. And I used to joke, and it's really not a joke, that I had done a long-term extensive survey and determined that the percentage of women in the United States who have experienced some sort of sexual intrusion, and by sexual intrusion, I mean everything from being harassed on the street to rape to sexualized murder. I would say that the percentage of American women who've experienced some form of sexual intrusion is 100%. That basically you don't need a study to document the experiences of women. Now, such research is important to nail down rates of rape and things like that. But all we have to do to let radical feminism kind of into our hearts is to tell the truth about everyday life from my point of view. And that's true for me, not only to women, but to men. And again, I always want to highlight, men and women don't suffer equally in this culture, right? But men do struggle with the demands that patriarchy puts on them. And for me, my life, I would say that when I engaged radical feminism, my life in some ways got a lot harder. I had to be more honest with myself. I had to be more aware, but my life got better. My ability to have meaningful relationships, not only with women, but other men, deepened. It's been a struggle. I'm 67 years old. I've been on this path now for 37 years, excuse me. And it's still a struggle some days. But if you ask me to go back to my pre-feminist consciousness, to live the way I did when I was a young man, there's no amount of money I would accept to do that. Because life, these are very emotional subjects, and I never know exactly when it's going to hit me. But my life isn't simple. It's not always easy. But I know that my capacity for connection to other human beings has deepened dramatically because of that feminism. And I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful I'm grateful to the women I was supposed to be afraid of, is the way I would say it.
That's so wonderful. And I have 1,000 more questions now,
Yeah.
hearing your reply. One thing that I hear so often is that any kind of critique around pornography or now like self-generated content like you were talking about, which is becoming very pervasive,
Yeah.
is kind of considered kink shaming, or that we're
Right.
shaming someone's sexual desires or attractions. And really what's happened, it seems, is in our culture at large, especially on social media, we see that if you raise any kind of thoughtful question towards
Yeah.
any part of this, like how is this affecting the people that are involved or the people that are consuming, whether it be they're buying sex or they're buying self-generated content or pornography, what's the effect on them, or what are the effects on their partners? So how do you respond when people argue things like that, like you're shaming someone or
Yeah.
you're trying to control them?
Well, I don't think a critical inquiry into how we come to acquire our desires is necessarily shaming anyone. After all, our sexual desires are like desires of other kinds. They're shaped not only by something internal, they're shaped by the culture around us. Right? So let's say you came to me and you said, listen, I'm eating McDonald's 3 times a day and my nutritional situation is pretty grim. If I said, well, let's look at how you came to acquire a taste for McDonald's 3 times a day, would I be food shaming you? No, I would be recognizing that because of advertising and other pressures, you might have acquired a habit of finding hamburgers, French fries, and Coca-Cola very attractive. And there's a reason for that, because they are attractive. I mean, they have a lot of salt, sugar, and fat, and that tastes good. Okay. So our sexual desires are like our entire life. They're a product not only of who we are internally, but where we are culturally. And that has to be examined. I can't imagine how we can't critically reflect on the culture we come from. And if the culture we come from eroticizes or sexualizes power dynamics, right? My whole life was, in a sense, being socialized into thinking it was most sexy for me if I could get control over a woman. Right? Well, is that inherent in me? Is that shaming me if somebody comes and points out, listen, you're trying to dominate women to get your sexual pleasure? Let's think about that. No, of course not. So, human sexuality is varied. We don't understand much about it, right? It's kind of a mystery to us. But if we can't ask a question, for instance, to someone who enjoys inflicting pain for sexual pleasure on another person, where that desire came from, and is that desire consistent with a decent human community? A lot of people are afraid of talking about morals when it comes to sexuality. And I agree we shouldn't moralize. I shouldn't get up on my horse and say, you, Carlie Ray, you're bad. Here's why your sexual desire is bad. That I don't think is helpful. But if we want to live in a decent human community, and that's my goal, right? Our sexual behavior is part of understanding how to do that. And we have to be able to talk about it. So I don't think I've ever shamed anyone when I ask, where do these desires come from? And importantly, who's making money off of the shaping of those desires? Because that often drops out, that we're not talking about some, academic discussion in a seminar about the construction of desire. We're talking about a world in which people are making millions and billions of dollars off the buying and selling of primarily female bodies. And I'm going to use that phrase probably another 50 times in our conversation, because that's what the sexual exploitation industries are. They're mostly the buying and selling of women's bodies, sometimes the bodies of vulnerable men, and sometimes even more sadly, the bodies of children, both male and female. But if we lose sight of what's really going on here, then any conversation we're going to have is almost by definition a dead end.
I'm so sorry, I have a cold today.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating to look at the statistics of people who, and statistics represent, a portion of people, but to
Sure.
see often patterns that we can link between people who are a part of the industry and then people who are also consuming the product or buying,
Yeah.
buying sex, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And one thing that we have tried to do with this book, True Images, is look at it's largely we're looking at it from a theological
Yeah.
perspective. And so from we're looking at if you're a Jesus follower and you're trying to faithfully follow Jesus, what does he say about your heart and your desires and what comes out of you and where it's rooted in you? But also we can see in a really pragmatic way what actually not only maybe what kind of people, or not, I shouldn't say what kind of people, maybe, like I said, what patterns might often lead people and what kind of vulnerabilities lead
Yeah.
people maybe to be a part of the industry or to consume the product, but then also the effects of that on people over time. And
Right.
while they're taking part in the industry or the effects on their life afterwards,
Yeah.
or if you're consuming pornography on a regular basis, the effects on your life and even your partner and your children and your community
Yeah.
at large. And so there's so many things to consider beyond
Yeah.
just the consumer or even the person who's involved, who's being bought or sold.
Right. Before I respond to that, let me say something about the theological versus secular approach. So you come at this with a religious faith. I don't. But does that mean we can't talk? Let's take something obvious. There's something in Christianity called the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. It comes out of the Hebrew tradition. It comes out of the Christian tradition. It might be the most central part of a Christian theology in some sense. Okay. Is that unique to Christianity? No. In almost every faith tradition in the world, there's some version of that. It's often called the ethic of reciprocity. Secular philosophy reflects that as well. So when you and I talk, we can focus on what's different in our philosophies, or we can focus on what's similar. And I think the Golden Rule is one of those things we have to focus on, because if you're a man and you're using a woman in the sexual exploitation industries, either through prostitution, pornography, whatever, it's a very simple thing to say, would I want to be in the position of that woman? Would I want to experience what she's experiencing for my sexual pleasure? And most often, I think most of us would say no. So the difference in our traditions is not trivial, but it's also not the only part of the story. So let's go to your question. What about those women in the sexual exploitation industries? How are they the same? How are they different from all women? Well, they're different in that there's a documented level of experience with childhood sexual assault for women in pornography, in prostitution especially, but also in pornography and other forms of sexual exploitation. Well, why is that relevant? Well, what does sexual exploitation mean? It has not only an effect on your body, it has an effect on how you come to see yourself at a very important point in your development. And psychologists are very clear about this, that children who've been abused often develop a concept that says essentially, this is what I'm good for. And I've heard women who've gotten out of prostitution say, I thought this was what I was made for. Right? And there's something so profoundly sad. It goes beyond sadness. There's a real deep grief for a culture that tells people your body exists only for the sexual pleasure of someone else, no matter how brutal it might be. All right, the minute we start asking those questions, consuming pornography or using women in prostitution becomes a very different experience. Right? And men have to deal with this. They have to ask, what is the effect of my acquisition of sexual pleasure on the woman whose body is the vehicle for that pleasure? And I think that's really crucial. But I would take it one more step. Think of a 10-year-old boy who has a computer at home and not a lot of parental supervision, and stumbles on not just to images of, sex, but sexual images that are rooted in this domination-subordination dynamic, often very brutal. Whether it's 10 years old or 12 years old or 14, this is an age in which our psychosexual development is very much still in process. What about the boy whose first experiences of sexual arousal are to those images, right? And then 5 years later, 10 years later, feels trapped in a very addictive-like cycle. Now, I'm not saying those men aren't accountable for their behavior. We're all accountable for what we do. But there's also a kind of, I think, compassion we have to have for children growing up in this culture. I mean, I came of age, well, it was a long time ago. Let's just say it was in the pre-internet age. And yet when we were boys, and I'm talking about grade school boys, we found ways to find, we called them nudie magazines. We found a way to steal the Playboy magazine that our fathers hid under the t-shirts in their drawer. I can still remember exactly where my father hid his Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler magazines. And I was not psychologically ready to see those images, right? And it had an effect on me, all right? And I can reflect on that now. I have a hard time imagining putting myself at that same age, being exposed to what's on the internet today and how overwhelming that would be. Now, these are just the facts of the culture we live in. And if we can't talk about that, if we immediately go to some abstract notion of sexual freedom and any critique of pornography is censorship, and then we've lost the game. And we're really condemning, another generation to these struggles. My friend Gail Dines, who I think of as my lifeline in this, we came up together researching, writing, and organizing around this issue. Gail once said to me when the internet was first getting started, she said, "We're about to conduct an unregulated social experiment on our children. We're going to expose them to all of this, and there's going to be nothing we can do to stop it. And 10, 20 years from now, we're going to see the consequences." And we are seeing the consequences. And Gail was right. And if we think about that, we're not talking about freedom of speech. We're talking about the largest and most dangerous unregulated social experiment ever conducted on children. And we're responsible for that as alleged adults with some capacity to make moral and political judgments.
Absolutely. There was a study that I was looking at, and we'll link all the things. All these are from the book, but I think they looked at 1,200, 1,300 kids, and they found that around 52% of them had seen a violent or aggressive, and not just, I mean, I think when people hear violent or aggressive, they don't understand how demeaning and how horrific some of these genres of pornography are. But then also it was looking at children under 12. I don't know if this was the same study or different. Like I said, we'll link everything. But they found that children under 12 who had been exposed to pornography are statistically more likely to assault their peers. And then, are tracking development over time. How does this affect them later in life? And unfortunately, now we are seeing in real time the effects of children who, since day one, have had technology at their fingertips. And like you said, a lot of children don't have any kind of regulations on what they're viewing or are exposed to it by someone else. Or, I mean, it's alarming how many students, young students, are regularly viewing pornography from a library or school computer. And it's so pervasive. And even if your child is, safe online on their devices, the likelihood that they'll be exposed to pornography by another child is so great. And it's really horrific how we're seeing this affect people's development now and then in the long run as they become adults.
Again, your questions are sparking so many thoughts. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories first, but back to my friend Gail Dines. I often think all I do is repeat things Gail said because she's so much smarter than me. But Gail once pointed out that one of the responses to this critique of sexualized media online is, well, that's what parents are supposed to do. And she said, for most of human history, the job of a parent was to socialize your children into the culture. Go back to tribal societies, tens of thousands of years ago. Right? That's what you did as a parent. You taught your children the ways of your people. Okay. She said the job of a parent today is to keep the culture out. Right? Keep all that bad advertising out. Keep all that cheap food out. Keep all those sexualized images out. And she said, guess what? Parents can't win. No parent can keep the culture out of your child's life. Right? So we're setting parents up to fail and not taking responsibility as a culture. Okay. Well, what does that mean? Let me tell you two stories. Long ago, when the internet was first becoming such a vehicle for pornography, I was giving a lecture about the feminist critique of pornography, and a young man, he hung around, he waited till everybody else had left after the event to ask his question, and he came up very carefully And he was very scared. And he said, I want to tell you something. He said, I've been using porn since I was really fairly young. And he was heterosexual. He was in a relationship. And he said, at this point, when I'm sexually active with my girlfriend, he said, I cannot become aroused unless I think about pornography in my head. In other words, there was a kind of perpetual porn loop that he used to achieve what should be arousal in the context of an intimate relationship with another human being. Right? There's something profoundly disturbing about that. And that goes back long before the internet had become, the kind of open sewer it is today. Let me tell you another story about a sexual educator who worked with college students. This goes back 3 or 4 years. And she was quoted as saying, when I do sex education with these young people, she said, I have to explain to them there are certain things that probably you shouldn't do on a first date, like choke a girl during sex. And when I read that, I thought, wow, when I was 18 years old in my first semester of college, if I had been in a sex education seminar, nobody would have thought to say, don't choke a woman during sexual intercourse, for the simple reason that none of us would have thought to do that, perhaps, except perhaps a really sociopathic person. Okay. Well, where did that come from? Where did the act of strangulation during sex become so common that a sex educator has to remind young men not to do that? Well, the answer is it comes from pornography. It's one of the, what I would say are distinctly pornographic sex acts. Now, I don't mean nobody's ever choked a woman during sex in real life. I'm meaning there are certain acts that are very common in pornography that have migrated into the culture, right? And that's probably the most disturbing one. The rise in the incidence of strangulation in a sexualized context, I think, has direct links to the pornography industry. And again, not just to pornography, the abstract concept, but to the industry that profits from creating and distributing those images. And if we're not alarmed by that, if we say that and somebody says, oh, you're just a prude, you just want to censor somebody else's desire, I think we're lost as a culture if we can't talk honestly about that.
I think another really crucial consideration we need to have is not just how it's conditioning young men and what they're expecting from a sexual encounter, but also how it's conditioning young women to, I've heard just heartbreaking stories of girls 12, 13 years old who have not only had extremely young and not on the track of healthy development, like extremely young encounters with pornography, but then also sexual encounters. And then also having this expectation that it's normal for someone to degrade them, to abuse them, to choke them, as you were discussing. And then also what repercussions that has on their mental state, but also then things like body image and so many things so many ways that this is affecting girls who are even prepubescent.
Absolutely. And I've heard those same stories. For a long time in male-dominated societies, women have been socialized to believe that their job in sexuality is to provide pleasure to men. And often that has really negative consequences. But when you kind of put that on steroids by exposing girls to the kind of images we're talking about, and I think, I'm not going to describe things. I don't think we need to get too graphic. But we're not just talking about sex. We're talking about increasingly, intensely cruel and degrading sexuality, often, if not overtly violent in the sense of, fists and knives and guns, abusive levels of hair pulling and slapping and all these kind of things. These aren't on the fringe. You don't have to go searching the dark corners of the internet for that. They come up in 5 seconds in a web search, right? And that's what girls are now exposed to as well. And I think it has deepened the problem that we're talking about. Can I be positive for just 5? It's hard to stay positive, but let's try. When you mentioned girls, I immediately thought of a friend, Melissa Tankard-Reist. She's in Australia, and she created and is the leader of a group called Collective Shout. And one of the primary ways that Melinda and her team work on this is to go into schools, to get to kids before they're in college, to talk at at middle and high school levels, and she's phenomenally good at it, as are the other members of her team. And when you hear her talk about how both girls and boys open up, they're hungry for some way to understand this crazy world they're being presented, right? And that's a hopeful way to approach this. One more hopeful sign, I mentioned my friend Gail Dines. She started a group called Culture Reframed, and her focus has been on educating parents. How can parents help their kids? And she and her staff have developed a really good parents program. So people are thinking about this, not just in legal terms, but in cultural terms. How do you reach young people? How do you reach parents? How do you help them? Because I think most people want help dealing with what seems like an out of control sexual society. And again, I want to emphasize, this doesn't make me a prude, right? I believe sexuality is a part of a healthy life. I'm a sexual person. This idea that anytime we bring this up, that we are somehow trying to shut down sexuality is a really, I think, severe distortion. Are there people with sexual hangups who criticize pornography? Sure. I mean, it's a big world. There's a lot of crazy people out there. But I'm talking about an analysis that is consistent with a healthy sexuality, right? Sometimes the people who support pornography are called pro-sex, and therefore we would be called anti-sex, I guess. I don't know. But that's really silly. Sexuality is a part of the human experience, right? The question is, do we develop sexualities that are consistent with a decent human community or not? And that doesn't make one pro or anti. It makes one concerned about the emotional and physical well-being of people, especially young people.
And something we've alluded to and not talked directly about is there's this complexity of consent when we talk about this conversation. And I think something that, well, we've just seen so many patterns over the past 20 years. And I grew up in a, very conservative Christianity, so I'm very familiar with the purity culture movement. And so, purity culture is kind of this reaction to the sexual revolution. And then, we have purity culture coming in and giving a lot of rules. And I mean, luckily there's a big critique from Christians saying, not only is this not helpful, but it's not really biblical either. Yeah. And then in kind of a backlash to a lot of purity culture, people have said, the only thing that really matters is consent. Did someone say yes or did someone say no? Yeah. And I had an interesting conversation with someone not too long ago, and we were talking about the commercial sex industry and talking about how there's so many more questions that need to be asked when it comes to why is this person participating in this thing? And it should, we have to ask more questions than did they say yes? What technically am I allowed to do, quote unquote, like in a legal sense? And they were kind of like, whoa, you have to be really careful when you ask those questions. And I think their main concern was, hey, if you start kind of peeling these layers back, then does that mean that all men are rapists? Or if a man consents to something with a woman and he didn't really crucially consider all of the reasons why she might be participating in this either sexual interaction, whether it's a hookup or buying her content from OnlyFans or viewing pornography that she's engaged in, does that make these men horrible people? I think that was his main concern coming to the conversation. I would love to hear your thoughts on that and kind of the distinction between not just like, what am I legally allowed to do, but going beyond that to say, how can I show other human beings the respect that they deserve as a human being?
Absolutely. Let's start with the distortion that feminism says all men are rapists. I've met many feminists in my life. I've read many feminist books. I've yet to hear any feminist say or write that because, of course, it would be ludicrous. There is a way in which, though, if you're a woman living in this culture, there are times you need to treat men as potential rapists. If you're walking down the street and you're alone and your car broke down and it's 1 a.m. and you see 3 guys coming at you, you would be advised to recognize those are potential rapists, right? To do what you can to keep yourself safe.
And be criticized if you're not, probably.
Yeah, right. And I don't take offense if a woman If I were that guy walking toward you on that dark street at 1 a.m., I would not take offense at your legitimate fear of what I might do. Right? And I would try to do everything I could to allay that fear and help. But it's not an assault on men to recognize the reality of women's lives and the justifiable fear so many women have. I don't mean every woman walks around terrified every minute. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about such fear. Now let's go to consent. I remember still when I first heard the concept of what's called by some people gray rape. In other words, not black and white, not obviously rape, not obviously consensual sex. And this was really emotionally very difficult to deal with. And I'll explain why in a minute. But the idea of gray rape is, imagine this was explained to me in a college situation. Imagine you're a woman, you go on a date with a guy. Maybe you go back to his place and you don't want to have sexual intercourse. You don't want to have any intense sexual contact at all. But let's say you're making out or whatever, and all of a sudden the guy gets aggressive. Right? Now, you don't know for sure that he's going to rape you, but you have a legitimate fear that in this situation it could get out of control. And I've heard women say that in that context, they have done things they did not want to do to provide, let's just be blunt, an orgasm for the guy to minimize the possibility of being assaulted because they didn't know what was coming. Okay, now, did she consent to go on the date? Yes. Did she consent to go to the guy's apartment? Yes. Did she consent to kiss him? Yes. But that doesn't mean she consented to what eventually happened, right? And it also doesn't mean that he raped her. It's a gray area, and that's the reality. So how often do women appear to consent to things because they see it as the most viable option to keep themselves safe? That really complicates any notion of consent. Let me give you another example. Let's say, going back to the women I've heard women coming out of prostitution saying they believed that because of their experiences as children, they believed their role in the world was to be prostituted to men. Did they consent to be in prostitution? Let's say they were 18 when they first turned a trick. Did that magically mean they were consenting to allowing men to use their bodies that way? Only if you ignore everything we know about the complexity of human psychology. So consent isn't enough. What we want to do is build a healthy sexual culture in which people feel free to explore themselves and their, emotions around sexual desire in ways that don't impose costs on other people. And in the culture we live in, that's largely a question of men and women, men in a patriarchal society being conditioned to expect what they want from women to be granted. Right? And consent is an important concept. Right? If I consent, if I go buy a product and I consent to buy it and it turns out I made a bad decision, I shouldn't have spent that money, I'm accountable for that decision. But consent is only the beginning of the conversation. It's not the end. I'm going to use this phrase again because it captures so much for me and it's so simple. I want to live in a decent human community. That means a community in which women aren't afraid when they pass me on the street. Right? That means a community in which I can explore my own complex emotional and sexual identity. Right? It means more than just, did I consent? Did she consent? It means struggling with the messiness of being human, because at this age, the only thing I'm sure of is that humans are much more complicated than I ever understood before.
Absolutely. One of the things that's part of my job is going to the high schools in our local school district, and we teach them about healthy dating, codependency, signs of abuse. A lot of it's just like, critical thinking skills, making good decisions in your relationships. And we talk about consent. I live in Utah, so we have and the school district here is very, very, very strict about what I'm allowed to say and what I'm not allowed to. But luckily they let me go pretty in depth on consent. And of course, we're not just talking about consent
Yeah.
when it comes to a sexual relationship, but I mean, just being in someone's vicinity and touching them or taking their photo or sharing
Yeah.
recorded images of them, and so many things that are really important to talk to young people, especially today, about. And one of the things that we really try to make apparent in this conversation is that consent is like we say it's like the basement floor. Like it should be
Yeah.
just step zero. It's like, oh, of course I'm going to consider if this other human being does or does not want to
Yeah.
participate in something with their own body, or having their image shared or whatever it is. But then you have to build a whole house
Yeah.
on top of that, like respecting them and valuing them. And one thing we really like to emphasize is that you have to treat a person like a person and not like an object. Otherwise, none of this really matters, because this is
Yeah.
not just you. You know, I think we've kind of conditioned our minds to think about consent in terms of legality, but also kind of like a monetary exchange. Like, I did my part, I
Yeah.
respected the consent, now I can do whatever I want. But to think, as you've been
Yeah.
discussing this whole time, about what effects does this have on this person, and also considering what kind of, when it comes to the commercial sex industry, what might have brought someone to this place, or is it really ethical for me to engage in a sexual encounter with someone just because I've given them money, but they're
Yeah.
in this position because they feel they have no other option,
Right.
or they don't really want to be here, but they have to feed their children some way. Or, there's so many more questions that we have to ask if we want to treat people like people.
Right. Let's take an even simpler example. There's a kind of obsession in this culture with looking hot. Is she hot? Uh, I've become just outraged by the language of hotness. Okay. So imagine you're a teenage girl, a college student, a female college student, and you're a normal person. You want to have a social life. If you're heterosexual, you want to date men, let's say. And everybody's asking, oh, is she hot? Well, there's this social pressure to present yourself in a way that fits the cultural notion of hot. And maybe that's about makeup, maybe it's about clothing, maybe it's things you wouldn't do yourself in any, kind of normal situation. But you're going out and you don't want to be isolated, because if you're not hot, you're a loser. And let's face it, kids are struggling desperately to figure out how to fit into social settings. Okay. So if you see a woman who shows up at a fraternity party, right, in skimpy clothing, heavily made up, right, looking hot, did she consent to that presentation of herself? Well, in some sense, yes, she's the one who put the clothes on, but she's responding to cultural pressures, right? And to simply say, well, that's her choice, is really quite silly, right? And so, from the most, mundane things about how we look every day, right, to these questions of really distressing sexual situations, we find again, consent isn't enough to explain how we're going to build that decent human community.
Absolutely. I'm thinking of just my personal experience, having experienced sexual abuse as a teenager. And then, I mean, just the things that happen to your mind and body, no matter what age you are, but when you are treated a certain way, and then your mind thinks, as you were saying, some people feel like that's
Yeah.
what I'm for. That's, someone has degraded me. That's all I'm worth.
Yeah.
Or even just like, for me, my personal struggle with it was thinking, and a lot of this was purity culture influencing this,
Sure.
but thinking, if I was beautiful, or if I was smart, or if I was valuable, then this person wouldn't have treated me this way. And so it put a lot of pressure on me to feel like I had to look a certain way. And then even just after, something terrible happens to you, sometimes you feel like you have to prove yourself to other people, or prove to people that
Right.
you're okay. And so it's, I mean, just so many things mentally and emotionally. And even now I'm almost 30, and I'm thinking, my husband and I have been talking about having children, and I'm thinking about motherhood. And if I'm being brutally honest, one of the things that's been on my mind is the
Yeah.
ways that your body changes when you have a child, and the way that there's just so many ways that society critiques women in general, but especially women's bodies after they change through childbirth. And there's just so many things, and it's a really interesting question to think about, presenting yourself to the world. And is this something that I And I mean, there's so many times where I've thought like, no, I don't want it. Like, I don't
Yeah.
want to have a relationship with my physical appearance this way. And it's been a huge journey to kind of
Yeah.
take my own control back over that. But there's, yeah, so many different things to consider. My brain
Yeah.
is thinking of a
Well,
hundred things.
let's acknowledge we're social beings, and being accepted by people in our social settings is important. And I'm not saying everybody should just say the heck with social
Sure.
relations. I'm saying the question is, where do these constructions of how we should look or how we should act, where do they come from? Let me do the flip side of your experience. So I was always the shortest, skinniest kid in my class. I was very effeminate. I was terrified of, being bullied. And of course, always lingering in the background, and I'll use the word we used back then, was the fear of being called a fag. Okay. I lived with that my entire childhood into high school because that was the way my body looked. Right. And I was terrified my entire childhood. When I got into my 20s, all of a sudden I grew 6 inches overnight, and I looked more like a quote unquote normal guy. And I tried to behave like a normal guy. In other words, I tried to be a real man. I tried to, have lots of sex. And the problem was I wasn't very good at it. Right? And it didn't fulfill me, and I knew there was something wrong. Right? So there is a cost to all of this insanity for boys too. Right? And not just boys like me who were particularly vulnerable, but as I said, every boy I ever met, remembers that experience. All right, so we're trying to get to a place not where people ignore their social groups, but where people try to build a culture in which you can be yourself without fear that you're going to be ostracized, or that you're not going to have any friends, or you're going to be a loser. I don't know if kids still call each other loser, but in my world growing up, it was the worst thing you could be called. And there were certain things that were going to brand you a loser, right? And you did anything to stay away from that. That's just normal human behavior, especially in adolescence and young adulthood, when people really are still finding themselves and when literally our brains are still developing. So, we've got to fight this individually. I have to get up every morning and say, I'm not going to give in to this. But we also have to build a healthier culture so we don't sacrifice our own children to this incredibly destructive industry, speaking now specifically of the porn industry, and how it distorts our own conceptions of our own bodies.
And I mean, social media has a major influence on this whole thing. Okay, one question I would love to get your perspective on is, so like I said, I go to the schools, I talk to kids about healthy relationships, codependency, all these things. And we give them different scenarios. We call it a game. It's not at all a game. I just say, give me a thumbs up if this person has consent and thumbs down if they don't. So I read these different scenarios and it'll be like, Johnny and Julie go on a date and Johnny asks Julie if he can give her a kiss and she says, yes, great, thumbs up. The one that every single class I've ever taught that always holds kids up is this scenario. So it's that Sydney and her boyfriend are watching a movie, and Sydney gets up to make popcorn, and when she comes back, her boyfriend is asleep. So does Sydney still have consent to keep cuddling with her boyfriend? And we say, we just have gone through this whole list with them of consent has to be enthusiastic, you have to be conscious, you have to be sober. There's all these different elements to consider when we're thinking about consent. But there's always a discussion, especially with the young men in the class, because first they say, well, I mean, it's a guy, and of course he would want to be touched by a woman. What does he care? I would never give any qualms about this happening. I wouldn't mind if someone was touching me while I was asleep. And then also they'll say they were doing it before, just a few minutes before. Why does it matter if he's asleep? And then usually it just brings up a discussion from the girl saying, well, I wouldn't mind if this happened to me. And so we always have a discussion about like, consciousness and unconsciousness, and then also, being awake versus being asleep and someone touching you. And we always pose this, just ask the guys in the room to think about it from a woman's perspective, and the young woman as well, to think, if you don't know exactly what's happened to you and you wake up and someone's touching you, that might be a really scary experience for you, especially if you've experienced something like childhood sexual abuse or, if you're assuming something happened and a lot of other things happened you weren't consenting to or weren't aware of.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else that you would add to that conversation or questions that you would ask? Or if you were
Yeah.
presenting that scenario, what would you say to this discussion?
Well, one thing that's obvious is that context is everything, right? So my wife and I have been together for about 20 years, and I regularly fall asleep earlier. And she says that sometimes she'll get into bed after I'm sound asleep and snuggle with me because it makes her feel good. Well, that's not a violation of any standard because there's a context to it, right? Now, if you move out of that and say, well, what if it's somebody you just met? Well, then the dynamic changes, obviously. And I do think there are some lines that clearly one wouldn't cross no matter what the context. So imagine someone is intoxicated and passes out. I can imagine, no matter what the relationship between those two people, I can imagine no circumstance in which sexual intercourse would be acceptable, appropriate, morally based. And I say that for two reasons. One is obviously that, cuddling and sexual intercourse are quite different, right, with different implications, right? And for me, it's impossible to imagine that kind of intense sexual interaction without clear consent from someone who's competent to give it, that is, not incapacitated. Okay, but I would push it a bit further. So if you're a woman and you're passed out because you drank too much, right? No man should feel the right to use your body, obviously. But I want to also ask a question: why is that sexually attractive to the man? Right? What kind of world do we live in where we've conditioned men to think that it doesn't really matter if your partner is conscious, able to respond, if there's even a hint of intimacy? If you can engage in activity that produces an orgasm for you, thumbs up, that's great, man. I mean, what have we done to our conception of ourselves as men where that's not only acceptable, but an enjoyable sexual experience? I can't imagine it, right? But of course, at one point in my life, I probably could have imagined it. If you put me back in my 25-year-old self, I don't know how I would have answered that, right? And I think that's partly why this is hard for men, because we often don't want to think about how we were socialized and how that socialization so often ignored what real intimacy means, ignored the interests of women in our lives. And of course, even in gay relationships, this can play out, right? We're talking primarily about the heterosexual dynamic, but I've talked to many gay men who feel like they were treated as a sexual object, right? That those same dynamics can translate into those relationships. So again, who do we want to be in sexual situations, which is partly asking, what is sex for in our lives? Yeah, it's about pleasure. Sexual pleasure is intense, and it's something we're biologically, designed to seek. But it's not the end of the story, because sex also has many other functions in our lives. It's a way we cement a connection to another human being. And you can't cement a connection to another human being if you routinely treat that person as an object. And of course, feminists have been arguing for as long as there's been feminism that the objectification of women, the reduction of women from complex whole human beings into an object that its sole purpose is the sexual pleasure of men, is inconsistent with any decent human community I can think of.
So fantastic. And for context, when I submitted these questions to the district, they analyze every word I say. So they did change it from sexual touching to cuddling for the
Understood.
to share with teenagers. But one of the things that we do discuss with them is it's a totally different story if, Sydney and her boyfriend, if they have a conversation about this and they share what their boundaries are around these things. And it's totally different if someone assumes consent, or they assume because we've participated in this yesterday that I can do this thing today. And it doesn't matter if this person is conscious or not. But it's so important that we ask and really encourage young people, not just to ask important questions, but to really strengthen that muscle inside their brains to think about things critically, but also just in a way to say, am I considering this the right way? And one thing I've really appreciated about your lectures and your work is that you don't say, hey, look, if you're not on my same page, this isn't for you, but to say, you don't have to be a radical feminist to agree with you don't have to agree with everything that I'm saying, but at least just consider these things and consider if they align with your values, or like you said, with, a flourishing society where we treat people with basic human dignity.
Yeah. I have very strong political and moral commitments, and I hold them because I think they're correct, they're appropriate, they're, the best story of the human condition we can tell. But I'm not, so arrogant that I think everybody else needs to fall in line. Just take the faith divide. I've never really been a person with religious faith. I've never had that experience. I don't come out of a family where that experience was common. And so that could be, that could have led me to reject your invitation to come and talk. But why would I want to do that? For one thing, I'm not going to learn anything if I reject everybody who doesn't think like me. And again, the older I get, the more I realize how much I have to learn. But I don't want to live in a world in which those kind of political or moral debates keep me from engaging with people. Because I know that the vast majority of American men are not going to become radical feminists in my lifetime. But I know that radical feminism spoke to me, and I can talk to men about how it spoke to me. And I can both acknowledge men's pain growing up in this society, and then try to get them to understand that women's pain is of a different character because of the nature of male dominance. That doesn't require having anybody sign a pledge card for radical feminism. I mean, it's just talking like human beings. And I think one of the things I have learned in aging, I hope, is that everybody's capable of arrogance that shuts off that conversation. I've seen arrogant Christians, I've seen arrogant radical feminists, and I'm just trying to get past that, not to deny the importance of the debate, but to recognize it's a hard world to live in. I had a long conversation earlier today with a woman who's more spiritually inclined, and we had this moment where we realized we were both coming from perhaps different perspectives, but struggling with a very simple fact. It's a hard world to live in. There is way too much suffering. Now, suffering is part of the human condition. We're never going to escape it. But there's suffering that this world heaps on top of just the problem of being human. I'm going to die. People I love are going to die. People are going to disappoint me. There's suffering. There's so much suffering in the normal, everyday human experience that when we see ways that something like the porn industry adds to that suffering, we should want to stop it, and we should want to find the human connection that can lead us all to do that, independent of ideology, theology, and anything else.
That's so fantastic. Robert, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. Do you have any closing thoughts to share with us? And also, please share where we can find you. You mentioned your website and some of your work that's available. Remind me the name of your book. Getting Off is the name of the book that's available for free.
Yeah, it was called Getting Off: Pornography and the End of Masculinity, meaning not the end of men, but the end of this very distorted conception of ourselves that we have. And as I said, it came out in 2007, but sadly, it's still relevant. The publisher went out of business, not because of my book, it just went out of business. But the good news was it allowed me to put a PDF online for free. So that book is available at my website, which you can get to most easily by just putting my name into Google, and it's the first website that comes up. I also have a lot of shorter articles that are organized by topic, and sometimes people don't want to read a whole book, and short pieces are there. And I think those are, I hope, resources that people will use, but will also lead them to read the feminist writers that I learned from. For instance, women like Andrea Dworkin, such a compelling writer who literally turned my life upside down in a good way. So, I'm happy when people read my work and learn something from it, but I also want to remind people that my work is derivative of the work of feminist women who did all of the really hard work to pioneer this kind of an assessment. I guess the only other, parting comment would be, again, to speak to men, because I think, my role in the world isn't really to tell women how to think. It's to say to men, whether you were the high school quarterback or the theater student, wherever you come from, we all grew up with this very distorted notion of what it means to be a man. And we all have to get past it if we want to be fully human. And I don't mean I have to disavow my male body or my sexual desire or anything. But up until the age of 30, I felt alone in that struggle. And I was profoundly unhappy. Not just because I was a depressed kid, I wasn't really a depressed kid, but because I was on my own trying to make my way through a world that told me I had to be something that I just was never going to be. And when I found feminism, I found a community, not only of women, but other men struggling with that. And that changes everything. When you're on your own, you're bound to fail. Sometimes men come to me and say, I want to quit pornography use, but I don't know how to do it. What do you tell me how to do it? And I said, I can't tell you how to do it, but I can tell you if you try to do it by yourself, you'll fail. Just like if you try to break an addiction to a drug by yourself, you'll fail. We need each other in this, right? And to repeat something I said right at the beginning, in that struggle for men to come together to help each other, feminism is not a threat. It's a gift to us. And I hope men will take that seriously. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you talking with us today.
Oh, it was a wonderful conversation. I'm so grateful that you invited me. Thank you.
Okay, that was Robert Jensen. I'm so grateful for his time and him talking and sharing with us. What were some key things that you took away after his conversation?
Well, there's a lot, and I think that part of it begins with understanding the baggage that we as listeners and we as people that are engaging in that interview bring to the table. We have to be aware of what our own suppositions are. So for me, a word like feminism it's a way to critique. It's something that I interact with regularly. It's something that I'm not particularly concerned with. But radical feminism is something that some people listening to this might be concerned with or might have issues with. And so I might just encourage listeners that as we begin to think about what was being said during the interview, to also use this as an opportunity to reflect on what your own assumptions are. Why are you feeling this way? And really, as you mentioned in your introduction to the interview, was that you can have these points of difference in metaphysical assumptions about assumptions of things and still arrive at similar conclusions about objectification. And so even if you don't necessarily agree with certain aspects of what was presented, the idea of open conversation, of not clutching pearls, so to speak, is worth reflecting on as we jump into our discussion.
And something, too, before we start is that I really appreciated about this when talking with Robert and some other folks that have really graciously given their time who have vastly different experiences and perspectives, is that this is kind of an issue that so many people from so many different backgrounds are coming together to say there's something really wrong going on here, and to have that community together that crosses over religious lines and political lines. Like Robert mentioned his friend Gail Dines, who we interviewed later on this podcast, and she is religiously Jewish and she's very politically liberal. And she was saying people often attack her because they think that she's like a really right-wing conservative Christian. And she's like, that's really not me at all. But they assume because I align with these certain issues, they assume certain things about my identity or my belief system. And so I think it's really great, especially when we have different backgrounds, when we can come together and say there's something really unjust going on here. And it's really important that we discuss it together.
I think that's a really good comment because I've had conversations with people who are asking, what political viewpoint do you line up with, or questions like that. And the conversations, especially if they're more Bible-centered or about Christianity, more become something of, there might not be one political system or viewpoint that adequately expresses all these ideas that you would encounter in Scripture, but there are components of a lot of different beliefs and belief systems that will include things that will also align with Scripture. And I think that's another thing where the value that was placed on humans, men and women, by Robert was something that, as a Christian, a follower of Jesus, I can also resonate with. And I think even over the way that the things God has been teaching me over the last few years, that's really important. It's an important value for me to embrace that as well. I also appreciated how he talked about the complexity of consent. There's things that we don't even think about with reference to consent that might make it a little more tricky to define. I thought that was valuable. And then also just how much culture shapes us, whether it's how we perceive women or men or sexuality, our purpose in life. I really do think that we sometimes, as followers of Jesus, even we confuse Christianity with culture, and so I think that's an important distinction that he made, and something that's valuable to talk about.
Just a thought of, he used that term radical feminism, and again, something that we mentioned before, like just hearing terms and listening to what those terms mean as people explain things, and just seeing the beauty of, I just see that displayed in Christ as becoming incarnate, like standing in the gap for people. And again, he's not saying like he's going to save everyone, but he's like, I want to identify myself with standing in the gap for people, like changing that cultural norm. He talked about cultural change that has led to the sex industry, the porn culture, even the ability of the institutional problems that lead to OnlyFans or needing to, some of those things. But this idea of redefining and those terms, and for us, like even when we hear that word, sometimes people just hear that word and be like, oh, I'm not going to listen to you because of this, that, or the other. But to really be able to listen, I think that's something that's come out a lot, and I think it comes through, and even this idea of a podcast is listening to one another, and it's I think that's huge. And one of the big things that I took away from was the definition of what a man is, and what does that look like in our culture. What does it mean to be a man, and from the context of Christianity, what does a man of God look like? And a lot of times even the church puts that with culture and not in a biblical standpoint, and I think that's affected even a lot of marriages and even a lot of relationships that I've been ministering to and with, and being able to say, hey, I want to stand in the gap and be radically loving in these different circles. And so there's a lot of stuff here that was really good. And some of the things that specifically that, just wanted to ask that question to myself, like, how do I view these people? How do I view the women that come across? And that's something that he talked about, was just the power disparity of, like, even just being a man walking down the street.
Again, I've delivered talks on the idea of how the very language that we use is tied to inequality, right? And so just, example, we have, languages that, terms that were originally intended to denote sex are changed to denote power dichotomy, right? And so it can be seen in the way that we talk about Weermen and Weefmen. So originally, man and woman were designated by spaces Weer and Weef, which became man. We see werewolf. That's the source of creation of that. And Weefman became woman. And so the standardized for what is human is man. Bunch of other discussions about royalty, lord, lady, et cetera, what we consider to be profane, a number of those different things are all tied to power dichotomies and often gendered power dichotomies. And so don't want to go off too much of a tangent, but perhaps as a way to sort of dovetail to a question, and that would be like a lot of what's been described is cultural practices. And the question I would ask the experts in the room, which are you all, is I've thought about the idea that if something exists as a cultural practice that is distinctly apart from the Christian tradition and the Christian narrative, but people attempt to incorporate that into the Christian narrative, is there concern or need to reject that attempt? So if you're scratching it, I sometimes I say something and I get this look like, well, if I have no idea what you're talking about here. But if we imagine, so for the ancient Greeks, this idea of manliness, of masculine, so this whole thing that was being described in the interview, I could point to elements in ancient Greece that mirrored with some elements of that. I could point to certain texts within Indian mythology, so the Indian subcontinent, Indian mythology, that relate to this sort of extremely ultra-masculine figure. So it's more of a human want or human envisionment of what masculinity is, opposed to what Christianity presents, which is the figure of Christ. And so do we feel like there's an effort to incorporate our culture about what's masculine, about what's feminine, about what people should be doing for the community into our religious practices, our religious communities? Am I making sense what I'm asking? Sometimes, again, I wonder if I'm...
No.
I've told everybody I turn into a pumpkin after a certain time, and I'm worried that I'm starting to grow my pumpkin tendrils a little earlier.
I mean, so this doesn't necessarily like relate directly with the interview with Robert, but I think in those terms, oftentimes I think protection and self-defense comes up in Christianity because maybe culturally in certain cultures in America today, it's highly valued. But then when you get into Scripture, maybe you could find examples of people who are defending themselves, and then you also find examples of people who are very much laying down themselves and their rights. And so maybe rights is a better way to frame it in America, like a lot of focus on what my rights are and not being deprived of my rights. But there are times I think where Christians are called to set aside their rights and their prerogatives. I think also this relates to a series that I taught through maybe a year and a half ago, but honor. We want to receive honor in different ways in our culture or be honored. And maybe that does relate with what Robert was talking about, especially from a masculinity point of view, where men are looking for honor and for respect, and maybe for things like conquest or like having their desires met. And so these ideas of kind of the guy that's the strong guy that gets what he wants, that gets honored and gets respected by people or even by a spouse or by a woman in his life, that's something that is deserved and that strength is appreciated. Whereas when you look at Jesus, oftentimes you see a lot of humility happening, and he's very humble in the way that he relates with people, and he is willing to be misunderstood. He's willing to be disrespected and dishonored culturally. Yeah. And so I think there are things in our culture that we just kind of think, we make assumptions this is just a part of Christianity when it really is something that it's a cultural value. But when you compare it to the way of Jesus, there's a gap.
Yeah. I think there is I would say the word repentance of the church and even pastors and leaders that have made it one and the same with a lot of different things. That's a whole nother podcast probably. for the church. And I think just with this specific interview, what I kept thinking of was that idea for our culture is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I kept thinking about that phrase over and over again. I was like, life and liberty. I really like that as part of our culture. But the pursuit of happiness leads to us being selfish a lot of times. And that's a part of our culture. I feel like our happiness doesn't always a lot of times it can be selfish. And that's where that idea of like consent, that idea of consuming pornography, consuming the sex industry is like, yeah, I have my life, I have my liberty, I want my happiness now. And so that quick consumption of that culture is, I think, honestly, it really is baked into just specifically our American culture, is this quick consumption, instant gratification that misses out on the people. And I think to radically love, as he calls himself a radical feminist, there needs to be a radical redefining of even our culture. And I think that needs to be preached and taught in the church to people. And something I talk about with my kids, or Shannon and I, is that starts from the kids. You don't have to hug your grandma if they are asking for it. I'll give you candy if you give me a hug. Like, none of that. Like, you start seeing that happen. Like, even something, and I would say it's innocent, but that's something that can compound later on. And so, not to be disrespectful, it's part of teaching. And we have different resources and books that that is school age appropriate. I just went over that with my son, is this idea of consent. And we had this a teacher at the school call us, and Oakland, when you hear this later on when you're older, thank you. But his classmate put her hand under his hand, and she held his hand, and he was like, I didn't really want to hold her hand. And so we got to talk about consent. Like, if she wants to and you don't want to, you could tell her. That's all right. And so being open, and it's uncomfortable as a parent, but it's uncomfortable as a pastor, but it's something that I think needs to be taught. And I'm learning that. But the conversation was good. You got to share it. Thanks, Oak. If you hear this later on.
And on a very simple level, the girl's happiness was holding your son's hand, but that was not your son's happiness. And that's where we run into all kinds of problems, right?
So again, being the bizarro person that I am, I think of these from different directions. And as we're talking about this, my mind goes, there's a famous philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant talks in his Ethics about humans. And one of the things he mentions is this distinction between dignity and price. Namely, that humans have a dignity. They don't have a value. And that's tied, and that doesn't mean that they're worthless. It means that they are so beyond worth that even trying to ascribe them a worth is dehumanizing them. And that's important because one of the things that's articulated is that humans are always, underline that 3 different times, an end, never a means. They're always a goal they are always the terminus in a discussion, not a means to get to the terminus. Yeah. And so if we think about things like OnlyFans, if we think about things like pornography, those sort of actions are taking an individual and objectifying them. Humans becoming a means to an end. And that end is pleasure, that end is power, that end is all illusory. But it is taking something that, again, philosophers have argued, have inherent worth, have inherent value, qua humans. Again, whether we use the word right, whether we use natural law, a bunch of different language describing similar things, and admittedly not similar things for philosophical-minded folks that are listening. But the idea that humans have dignities, humans are never to be used as means. Mm-hmm. And so many of the relationships, not just sexual relationships, but so many of the relationships that we have professionally, socially, etc., are really using people as a means to an end.
And that's many of these things are good. And you'll see a theme in a lot of conversations is that you take something good and we, because of our selfishness, because of our sin, we pervert it. We make it into our image rather than, the image of God that we want people to see. You want to see that, and yeah.
And I think it's such a struggle for people. I've heard a lot of young men express this tension because they feel like on one hand, it's like there's maybe a movement in our culture because of feminism or whatever it is that is making them feel like being a man is bad, masculinity is inherently bad. And then on the other side, it's maybe like an Andrew Tate kind of figure that says you're just here to like use up women and you have more value and all of these things. And, just a really dehumanizing view of women and what that means it is to be a man. And I think that there's just like a lot missing for those people. They're trying to find who they're supposed to be and what it's supposed to be a man. What does that mean and what does it look like and how does that mean I interact with women and sexuality? And it's really complicated because they feel like it's only these two extremes and I'm somewhere in the middle. And I think as Christians, we have the opportunity to show them that your goal is to be more like Jesus, and your goal is to uphold the dignity of other people and bring light to the darkness and healing to brokenness. And when we look at things only through the lens of consent, then it kind of just makes it about what technically I can or cannot do, or even in the legal sense, what is technically legal and what am I going to, be charged for or go to jail for. And what we want to do is say, how can I value these other human beings? And when we teach people to be more like Jesus, it's uplifting other people and treating them with the inherent worth that they have as living images of God. And also to bring, all of those things that I just talked about. And I think that really changes the frame of the conversation. And even scripturally, I think really, there only 2 passages in the New Testament that have language about, men or women here talking directly to you. And we can read those through the proper cultural lenses to figure out what's going on. But most of the time when either Jesus or the apostles are talking to people that, a group that Jesus is talking to or a church that they're writing a letter to, they're talking about how to be people that represent their Savior to a really broken world. And if we can give people a vision for that, then I think it gives them a little more space and freedom to figure out what it means to be a really good man or a really good woman and how that plays into issues like consent. Because we have, it's just like purity culture and porn culture. We have 2 things that say to men, you're just an uncontrollable animal. You can't figure this out. And porn tells people, it's not just like sometimes people might stumble across porn. There's this is a multi-billion-dollar industry that's grooming really young boys to think that the way that you treat women, this way is acceptable or this is what men want. And it's not just like maybe a little demeaning. It's like in most cases, the average porn scene is like torture. And so that's going to really shape and mold people's minds. And we have the opportunity to really step into that space and show people what it means to be a person that looks like Jesus.
I think Robert was good at exposing to some of the flaws and just looking at, do I have consent? And that's kind of what you were addressing, is it's about something more than that. It's about, am I treating these people like Christ would treat them? Am I seeing them, valuing them as, as a whole person and not just consuming and things? But he was good at pointing out, I think, how if you're just looking at the standpoint of consent, you might not know something about traumas people have been through in the past and how that's going to play into consent. Maybe they're going to give consent because they've been conditioned to do that in the past, or maybe they just feel uncomfortable. Maybe they're fearful of maybe a man having more physical strength or getting disappointed or the reactions, and so they're giving in just to placate someone or because they're feeling fear. There's just a lot of different dynamics that we are not always aware of, and I think that's important too, because some people would say, well, if I have their consent, then it's perfectly fine. Like, I don't share a biblical ethic, for example, and so that's really what I'm going on. But I think he was good at showing that might not really be enough because there's other factors that are at play, and that's wise to consider that if you're just looking from a standpoint of consent.
So, and I would say that when we're talking about masculinity and how that relates to how we treat other people, again, I know regularly say we need to think historically, but dang it, we need to think historically. So, I mean, you can look to there's the meme that exists now between Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, Mr. Rogers, and Bob Ross. Bob Ross told us to love. Mr. Rogers taught us to love ourselves. Steve Irwin taught us to love animals. Bob Ross told us to love nature. That you have strong male figures. You have strong male figures in artistic expression. Again, I'm showing my nerdiness here. Captain Jean-Luc Picard, extremely a person who is going to commit themselves to protecting as many people as possible. That you have, again, you go back further historically. You have Gawain and the Green Knight, a whole story about honor and respecting one's authority that is not your own. And if you really want to get hardcore, you look at the martyrs and the history of the disciples, the deaths of the disciples. That again, for many of us in the Protestant tradition are not familiar with. You want to see some pretty hardcore behavior, like how are you going to be like going up against unbeatable odds and refusing to back down for something that you believe in. Being flayed alive is one of those things that you encounter when you look at the history of the martyrs. And so I think that it's there, but because we're often so fixated on immediate culture and immediate things that happen to us, we lose sight of that. So I do think that there is a larger history of healthy masculinity, especially within the broader tradition of the Christian tradition. It's not, again, not universally. There's obviously going to be some awful stains, but there are figures when you look throughout history of positive masculinity understood through history or church history or even fiction.
And I think one of the things that we hopefully want to and hopefully can portray to the next generation is whatever resources you have or whatever strengths or personality traits or things that are unique to you, use them for the good of other people, use them for the good of, sharing the gospel with the broken world, and use them because you have unique strengths, or, and maybe it is that you're a father, or maybe it's that you're a husband, or maybe you're a single man. Last week we were talking about Colton and his story of finding community as a same-sex attracted Christian who's committed to celibacy. So whatever the position is that God has called you to, then do a good job of managing the resources that he's given to you.
Let me ask you, how does the Real Truth Ministries approach? I know that you've done consent trainings and that you've had conversations with students. And so when the Real Truth Ministries, when you have these conversations, what types of things do you emphasize when it comes to maybe masculinity or femininity or consent? What are some things that's important to focus on with students?
Well, one of the things that we really want to emphasize is human value above anything else. And of course, when we go to schools, it's not like I'm, teaching them from like a biblical perspective, but trying to use those biblical values to help them understand some of these concepts. And so I think consent alone, statistically, it's not like you can just say, don't do something and ask for consent. And it really doesn't change a lot of people's minds. But hopefully to help people understand and help kids who are starting out relationships and dating for the first time to see this is not just about this, like this person said yes, it's that we want to treat a person like a person and not like an object. And so we always start out by reminding people of their value and that there's this level of respect for other human beings and for you, that you should be safe and respected. And that means that what happens to you and to other people is really important. And we want to help you understand that when someone's with you, you want to make sure that they feel safe and they know that they can trust you and that you're someone who's going to go above and beyond, not just to figure out, like, did you say yes or no, but am I making sure that you feel like dignified as a human being? And so that's kind of the approach that we take, because it's easy to just say, don't do this, kids, and try to do better, but to really change the mindset around what are we actually talking about here. And so that's why, I think we discussed it in this interview. We do these little exercises with them and we talk about different scenarios and what do you think about this and how would you react if, you were with your boyfriend or girlfriend and this happened. And I think that's one of the most helpful things I've found is to have kids discuss and actually talk about what they think or why they would disagree with that, and kind of pick their brains and say, well, what are we actually talking about here, and why do you think that? Or would it change your mind if this happened? And it seems like that's a really good springboard, especially for teenagers.
I think it's great that you're focusing on causing them to think and maybe redefine the way that they look at relationships. I had a college professor who stands out. He had a quote that he would say a lot, and it was, to those who allow ourselves the luxury of thinking. And it really is, a lot of times we're just going based on what we've been taught or what culture teaches us. But when you pull people out of maybe just autopilot and you provoke them to think, how do I see relationships, healthy relationships? I think that's an amazing approach.
Thanks.
Thanks for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I really appreciate you guys being a part of this conversation and asking really good questions and giving really good input as dads and pastors and teachers and professors and all of the like that you are. And I think it's really good to have conversations about these things because we live in a world where we are really emphasizing consent right now, and consent is the only thing that you need, and that's why all of the things that are happening are okay. And if we can hopefully compel people to think a little bit more about how behavior affects ourselves, just use some critical thinking skills, but really long term, like, man, think about this person and what will these behaviors do to this person mentally or physically over time, or how is this going to affect them, whether it's hookup culture or porn culture or, they're being trafficked or, whatever the situation is. Like, what is the impact of that on another human being?
That sounds like a good place to close out for us. So.
All right. Well, we'll be back next week with another interview.